They mistake her silence for absence. They mistake her stillness for surrender. But some women don't disappear. They descend into the one place no one thought to look, themselves. And what returns from that depth was never meant to be underestimated twice. Welcome back, wisdom seekers. There was a version of her they thought they understood. Quieter now, smaller now, easier to dismiss. They mistook her retreat for defeat. They were wrong. What you're about to witness isn't a return to who she was. It's an arrival at who she became while no one was watching. If her comeback moves something in you, let it be known. Press subscribe and walk this road with her. Before we go further into her story, a quieter one waits for you. In the space I've built just for the wisdom seekers who want to go deeper, the link is in the description, and in the very first pinned comment, you'll find reflections, letters, and entire narrated pieces that live nowhere else. Not louder versions of what you find here, different ones, closer ones, written for the woman who doesn't just watch her comeback, but is living one of her own, right now, in private. If that's you, that space is waiting. Come find what was written for you. 1. The underestimation was the setup. No one hands a woman her power. She has to be underestimated first, so she can prove quietly to herself alone what she was always capable of holding. This is the part they never understand about her kind of comeback. It didn't begin with a triumph. It began with a dismissal. Someone looked at her, decided she was smaller than she was, and walked away satisfied with their own conclusion. What they didn't know is that every dismissal is a door closing on one version of her and opening on another. The woman who is doubted in public is rarely broken by it. She is simply relieved of the burden of proving herself to people who are never going to see her clearly anyway. That relief is where the real work begins. Without an audience to perform for, without expectations to manage, she is free to build in private, at her own pace, according to her own architecture. This is the quiet gift hidden inside every underestimation. It removes the pressure to be understood and replaces it with the freedom to become. She stops asking whether people believe in her. She starts asking what she is actually capable of, unwatched. And in that unwatched space, something happens that no one predicted. She grows sharper, she grows steadier. She grows into a version of herself that no longer needs permission to exist fully. The people who wrote her off were not entirely wrong that something in her had changed. They were simply looking at the wrong direction of the change. They expected diminishment. They got evolution instead. This is why every comeback rooted in true transformation always looks from the outside like it arrived overnight. It didn't. It was built in the exact silence they mistook for surrender. The underestimation was never an obstacle to her story. It was the opening chapter, written by people who thought they were closing the book. And so, if you have ever been dismissed, doubted, quietly written off by someone who decided they already knew your ceiling, let this be the reframe you needed. That dismissal was not a verdict. It was an invitation, disguised as an insult, to go build somewhere they couldn't see. The setup was already working in your favor before you even noticed it had begun. 2. She didn't vanish. She withdrew her permission. There is a difference between disappearing and simply stopping being available, and almost no one around her understood which one was actually happening. She didn't vanish. She revoked access. Access to her time, her attention, her explanations, her constant presence in conversations that drained more than they gave. This distinction matters more than it seems. Disappearing implies loss, implies something taken from her without her consent. But what she did was an act of ownership, not absence. She looked at who had access to her energy and quietly decided that access was no longer a given. It was something to be earned, and most people simply hadn't earned it. This is uncomfortable for people who are used to unconditional access to a woman's attention. They call it coldness. They call it distance. They call it 100 things that make her withdrawal sound like a flaw rather than a boundary. But a woman who withdraws her permission is not punishing anyone. She is simply protecting the one resource she cannot get back once it's spent, her presence. And presence, real presence, was never meant to be handed out freely to everyone who asked for it. It was meant to be given deliberately to the people and pursuits that could hold it with the same care she gave it. So she stopped answering to everyone. She stopped explaining her choices to people who had no stake in her outcome. She stopped showing up fully for relationships that only wanted her partially. This wasn't disappearance. This was selection. And selection, when practiced by a woman, is almost always misread as rejection, when really it is the opposite. It is her choosing, finally, to be fully present somewhere that deserved it, instead of thinly spread everywhere that didn't. What looked like her going quiet was actually her going deliberate. Every person who lost access to her didn't lose her randomly. They lost her because somewhere along the way they stopped earning what they once had, and the ones who remained, the ones who still have her, should understand exactly how rare that access has become. She didn't vanish from the world. She simply stopped being available to the parts of it that never deserved her in the first place. 3. Silence. Was the workshop not the wound? They kept waiting for her to explain the silence, as if it were something that happened to her, rather than something she chose. As if quiet were a wound to be diagnosed, rather than a workshop where the real construction was taking place. This misunderstanding says more about them than it ever did about her. A culture obsessed with constant noise, constant sharing, constant narration of every feeling in real time, has forgotten that some of the most important transformations require nothing to be said at all. Her silence was never empty. It was the sound of tools being used, of old versions of herself being taken apart, examined, and either kept or discarded. It was the sound of a woman doing the unglamorous, unwitnessed labor of becoming someone new without an audience narrating her progress back to her. There is no highlight reel for this kind of work. No one posts about the version of themselves that is quietly dismantling a decade of people-pleasing. No one applauds the private decision to stop reacting, to stop explaining, to simply observe instead. And so, from the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. It looked like stillness, maybe even stagnation. But inside that silence, everything was happening. She was reading her own patterns for the first time, without flinching away from what she found. She was sitting with discomfort instead of numbing it. She was learning to be alone with her own thoughts without needing them softened by distraction. This is not wounded behavior. This is workshop behavior, deliberate, focused, and entirely uninterested in being witnessed. The finished product is what the world eventually sees, polished and composed, and they call it a comeback, as though it appeared from nowhere. But nothing worth having ever comes from nowhere. It comes from exactly the kind of silence she was living in, the kind that looks like withdrawal from the outside and feels like construction from within. She was never broken in that quiet season. She was building. And every woman who has ever gone quiet under the weight of her own becoming should know this. Your silence is not a symptom to be fixed. It is a workshop. And what you build there in private will eventually speak louder than anything you could have said out loud. 4. The applause. She stopped waiting for. For most of her life, she had been fluent in a particular kind of performance, the kind that waits for a reaction before deciding whether an action was worth taking. She would accomplish something and immediately scan the room for approval. She would make a choice and quietly need someone else to confirm it was the right one. This is not weakness. This is what happens to a woman who has spent years being told, directly or indirectly, that her instincts required outside validation before they could be trusted. But somewhere in her quiet season, something shifted. She stopped waiting for the applause, not because she stopped caring about connection, but because she finally understood that a standing ovation from the wrong room means nothing, and silence from the right one is worth more than noise from 100 wrong ones. This shift didn't happen loudly. It happened the first time she made a decision and simply didn't tell anyone. It happened the first time she succeeded at something and let the satisfaction stay private, undiluted by the need to announce it. It happened the first time someone failed to notice her growth, and she realized, almost with surprise, that it didn't diminish the growth at all. The applause she used to wait for was never actually about the accomplishment. It was about needing someone else to confirm her worth was real. And the moment she stopped needing that confirmation, her power stopped leaking outward, dispersed across 100 people whose opinions never should have mattered that much in the first place, and started compounding inward instead. This is the quiet mechanism behind every comeback that looks, from the outside, like it happened without warning. It is not that she suddenly became powerful, it is that she stopped giving her power away in exchange for approval, and so it simply accumulated, unspent, until it became undeniable. She still celebrates. She still shares joy with the people who have earned a place in her life. But she no longer performs her wins for an audience whose validation she used to need in order to feel like the win was real. She knows now. She doesn't need to be told. And if her story of return is stirring something loose in you, something about your own quiet season, your own rebuilding, there are two companions written for exactly this. The Power of Her Distance and Choose Yourself Softly. Both linked in the description, both waiting in the pinned comment, where you'll also find a wonderful gift set aside just for you. 5. What they called cold was actually complete. They had a word for what she became. They called it cold. They called it distant. They called it too much or not enough, depending on which version served their narrative that day. What none of them called it, because none of them recognized it, was complete. A woman who no longer performs warmth she doesn't feel is not cold. She is finished pretending. For years, she had softened herself into shapes that made other people comfortable. Smiling when she wanted to sit in silence, agreeing when she wanted to disagree, staying warm toward people who had long since stopped deserving her warmth. That performance had a name too, though no one called it by its true name at the time. They called it kindness. It was actually depletion, dressed up so it wouldn't alarm anyone. When she stopped performing it, when her warmth became something she offered selectively rather than automatically, the people who had grown used to unconditional access to her softness experienced its absence as a personality change. It wasn't a change, it was a correction. She had simply stopped giving away a warmth that was never replenished, to people who never noticed it was costing her anything at all. What looked like coldness from the outside was, from the inside, the exact opposite. It was the feeling of a woman finally whole enough not to need everyone's comfort at the expense of her own. Completeness does not perform. It does not need to convince a room it belongs there. It simply exists, undisturbed by whether the room understands it or not. This is the kind of presence that unsettles people who are used to women shrinking themselves into palatability. Her stillness, once mistaken for withdrawal, is now something closer to gravity. The room reorganizes around her without her needing to ask for anything, and still they reach for the old words. Cold, distant, different, as though completeness were a defect rather than the entire point. She has stopped correcting them. She no longer explains that what looks like ice is actually the surface of something deep and settled. Something that no longer needs to prove it's warm underneath. Let them call it whatever helps them make sense of a woman they can no longer read as easily as before. She knows what it actually is. It is not the absence of warmth. It is the presence, finally, of a woman who is no longer bleeding it out to anyone who simply asked. 6. The return has no explanation attached. There is a question she used to feel obligated to answer, and somewhere in her quiet season, she quietly stopped answering it. Where did you go? What changed? Why are you different now? People ask these questions as though they are owed the story, as though her transformation is a debt she must settle with an explanation before she is allowed to simply exist in her new form. She no longer pays that debt. Her return requires no context to be valid. This is one of the hardest lessons a woman learns on the way back to herself, that she does not owe anyone the narrative of her healing in order for the healing to count. She does not need to perform her growth in a way that makes it legible to people who weren't present for the work. She does not need to translate her transformation into a story that satisfies their curiosity or eases their confusion about who she used to be versus who she is now. The old version of her would have felt guilty about this. She would have over-explained, softened the edges of her change so it didn't unsettle anyone, apologized in advance for becoming someone new. The current version of her understands something different, that an explanation offered under pressure is not honesty, it's appeasement, and she is no longer in the business of appeasing people who feel entitled to a story that was never theirs to demand. So when she returns different, sharper, more settled, less available, she does not open with an apology or an essay. She simply arrives as who she is now and lets the people around her adjust their understanding without her assistance. This unsettles people who are used to being handed a narrative they can process comfortably. It should unsettle them. A woman who has done the work of rebuilding herself owes her explanation to exactly one person, and that person is not standing in the room asking questions. She is the only witness who was actually there for the whole process, and she is the only one who needs to understand it. Everyone else gets the result, not the footnotes, not the justification, just the woman, returned, complete, requiring no one's permission to simply be who she has become. 7. They prepared for her absence, not her evolution. Here is the specific shock that no one saw coming, the exact miscalculation buried inside her comeback. The people who underestimated her prepared for one outcome only. They prepared for her to stay away, to stay diminished, to confirm the smaller story they had written about her in her absence. What they did not prepare for, what genuinely never crossed their minds, was that she might return not less than she was, but entirely transformed. This is the gap between expectation and reality that makes a quiet comeback feel, to everyone watching, like an earthquake. They had built an entire narrative around her disappearance. Some version where she struggled alone, where the distance humbled her, where she would eventually return, needing what she once needed from them. That narrative was comfortable. It kept their own position secure. It meant they never had to reckon with the possibility that her absence wasn't a wound she was nursing, but a forge she was standing inside of, becoming something none of them had accounted for. So when she returns, and she is not smaller, not humbled, not in need of what they assumed she'd come back begging for, the shock is real. It is not manufactured for effect. It is the genuine disorientation of people who spent her absence writing the wrong ending to her story. They imagined a woman worn down by time apart. They got a woman sharpened by it instead. They imagined someone who would slot back into her old role, grateful for the return of familiar dynamics. They got someone who has renegotiated every one of those dynamics from a position of newfound clarity and has no interest in returning to versions of relationships that required her diminishment to function. This is the quiet devastation embedded in every real comeback. Not that she proves them wrong loudly, but that her mere presence, unbothered and evolved, makes their entire prepared narrative collapse without her needing to say a single word about it. They spent her absence preparing for the wrong woman to walk back through the door. The one who actually did was never coming back the way they expected. She was only ever coming back as herself, fully arrived, and that alone was enough to dismantle everything they thought they understood. 8. A comeback that doesn't perform itself. There is a version of a comeback that announces itself, loud, declarative, structured entirely around being witnessed. That was never going to be hers. Her comeback does not perform itself because performance would mean she still needed an audience to validate that the transformation was real. She doesn't. This is the final, quietest form of her power, and also the most unsettling one to witness. A woman who has truly returned to herself does not need to convince anyone of it. She does not narrate her own growth in real time, does not stage moments designed to prove how far she's come. She simply exists, differently, and lets the difference speak in a register that doesn't require translation. This is why her presence alone recalibrates a room without her doing anything deliberate to cause it. People feel the shift before they can name it. Something about the way she no longer scrambles to fill silence. Something about the stillness in how she holds a conversation, unrushed, unbothered by the need to be understood immediately. Something about the fact that she is no longer negotiating for space. She simply occupies it, and the room reorganizes around that occupation whether it wants to or not. This kind of comeback cannot be manufactured. It cannot be staged for effect, because the moment it becomes a performance, it stops being true. What makes hers undeniable is precisely that she isn't trying to make anyone believe it. She isn't asking for applause. She isn't waiting to be told she's impressive. She is simply finally fully inhabiting the version of herself that the quiet season built, and letting that inhabitation be the only proof anyone needs. This is the comeback no one saw coming, not because it was hidden, but because it never announced itself the way comebacks are supposed to. It arrived the way real transformation always arrives, quietly, completely, and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone was ready to witness it. They underestimated her once. Standing in front of the woman she has become, unhurried and unbothered by their disbelief, they will not make that mistake again. She was underestimated once. That mistake will not be made twice. Let this be the reminder you needed, that your quiet season was never emptiness, it was construction. And when you rise, wisdom seeker, may you rise the same way she did, unannounced, unbothered, and utterly unmistakable. If her comeback found you at the right moment, the deeper version of this space is waiting. The link in the description, the pinned comment, always open for the wisdom seekers ready to go further. And should you want the two companions for your own quiet rebuilding, they're there too, along with the gift left just for you. Until we meet again, rise quietly, wisdom seeker. Let your comeback speak the language only silence can teach.